Hello there. There is what is called the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty coming up. But shouldn't it be every day, with extremes for the have-nots getting worse for the first time in 20 years, while the opposite is true for the world's wealthiest? How to make lasting change for the better. This is Roundtable. Well, in this programme, we'll be looking at success stories, countries where millions have been helped, and talk to the man at the United Nations whose job it is to protect an ever increasing number of those on the margins. According to the United Nations, 1 in 10 people in developing regions still lives on less than $1.90 a day. Significant progress has been made in many countries within Eastern and Southeastern Asia, but the UN reports up to 42% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa continues to live below the poverty line. Estimates from the World Bank suggest that between 88 million and 115 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty in 2020 due to the economic crisis caused by COVID-19. But some countries have enjoyed success in lifting millions out of poverty. So can they offer others hope when it comes to the urgent question of how to beat poverty? Okay, well, a little bit later we'll be hearing from Colombia, from Indonesia, and from a global anti-poverty charity. But right now I'm very pleased to say we can welcome to the programme Olivier de Schutter, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Very good to have you with us, Olivier. Some reduction in extreme poverty has been made. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and we'll look at some figures in just a little while. And yet you say the progress is insignificant. What do you mean?
Well, we usually measure the progress in reducing poverty with the international poverty line, which is extremely low. The measure used by the World Bank is $1.90 per day in 2011 prices and parity of purchasing power, which means in concrete terms that it's equivalent to, for example, 1.41 euros per day in Portugal today in 2020. That kind of measurement of poverty is barely significant. It really is not the kind of income with which you can live decently. It's barely enough to survive. And so we should use a measure of poverty that is much more significant and that allows to capture the reality of many people in many societies who are excluded from society because they cannot match the average lifestyle that the middle class has. And I think that's why the self-congratulatory statements about poverty being tamed seem to me often exaggerations.
So what do you think has gone wrong?
Well, we have a situation in which economic growth has been perceived as necessary for any social progress to be achieved because economic growth was seen as the precondition for social policies to be developed. But in the name of economic growth, we've stimulated competition at a global level with trade liberalization being promoted. We've stimulated the arrival of foreign direct investment in countries in order to create employment and transfer technologies. And we've developed a range of policies in the area of labor markets, deregulated labor markets, in order to attract investors. And the price we are paying is increased inequalities, a very unequal type of development in which, of course, wealth is created for the happy few, but does not trickle down to many people in the lowest quintiles of the population. So unfortunately, the economic progress that was made has not translated into significant improvements in well-being for many people across the globe.
And yet lives have been changed, haven't they?
Well, we have fewer people living in destitute conditions, in extreme poverty than, say, 30 years ago. But at the same time, inequalities have increased. And we have in many countries a growing gap between, on the one hand, those who have secure employment, are protected by social protection, and many others who are in the informal sector, who are not protected at all by social protection, work for wages that barely allow them to survive, and that gap has been increasing. Today in the world, we have 55% of the population that has no social protection whatsoever. We have 61% of people working who are either in the informal sector or in precarious forms of employment without the guarantees that normally wage workers should have a right to. So it still is very unequally spread, the wealth that we managed to create.
Let's take a look at some figures from the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Extreme poverty affects 1 in 5 children. In cases of workers from 2010 to 2019, extreme poverty has gone down from 14% to 7%. 6% of the world's population will be affected by 2030, and the biggest increases Southern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the pandemic will add another 70 million to the extreme poverty bracket. Let's talk about the pandemic. How do you stop that getting even worse? I don't mean the disease, I mean the extremes of poverty.
Well, for the moment, governments have reacted in a very ad hoc fashion. They have adopted as emergency schemes a number of social programs that altogether amount to some 690 billion US dollars, which is a fraction of the 11 trillion US dollars they've injected in the economy. So they've done quite a bit to protect the social rights of people in poverty. But many of these programs are very short term. They have not protected people by standing rights-based social protection schemes. And the fear is that poverty shall further increase in the next few months because the temporary measures adopted are now being phased out, as they have been designed to last essentially for the time of the lockdown of the economies. So unfortunately, the figures of extreme poverty will go up further, and all world regions will be affected, but particularly developing countries, because developing countries face a very high level of public debt. They are unable to borrow at acceptable conditions from international markets, and they cannot continue to finance social protection as they may have until now to protect the population from the worst impact of the crisis.
China, on one of its state media sites, boasts about poverty going down over the last 40 years from 97.5% to just under 2%. And it adds this: we now offer Chinese wisdom and solutions to global poverty reduction. I won't read out the whole quote, but are there things that can be learned from a country such as China?
Well, first of all, China accounts for a very significant reduction in global poverty rates. In absolute terms, China between 1990 and 2015 moved from 750 million people in extreme poverty to barely 10 million people in extreme poverty today. So the progress has been significant in China. And
But can we learn from China?
Well, what you can learn from China is that industrialization, which was very significant over the past 30 years in China, with massive migration from rural areas to the eastern coast of China in particular, industrialization is a very powerful tool to reduce poverty. Of course, this has also led to increased inequalities, but primarily it has meant that many very poor households in rural areas have benefited from remittances from some members of the family traveling to the large industrial cities built in this period and exporting to the world markets. So to a large extent, the low-cost consumption items that we have benefited from in rich OECD countries are the result of this industrialization of China and have benefited China tremendously. The question is whether
perhaps it's very difficult to draw any kind of proper lesson from China for the rest of the world unless you industrialize on a scale that country has done, which is something that's been happening in the West for the best part of 150 years. China's of course, very rapid change in society. I want to thank you very much indeed, Olivier de Schutter, for coming on this edition of Roundtable. Very good to have your thoughts.
Many thanks. My pleasure.
So let us welcome to this round table Aryo Ilhamna, Indonesian economist, who will explain how his country has been so successful in reducing poverty. The same applies to Felipe Roa-Clavijo, researcher and Global Policy Network lead, who will give good examples from his country, Colombia, and also Sierra Leone. And we say hello once again to Asad Rehman, Executive Director at War On, Want the Anti-Poverty Charity. Felipe, let me ask you first of all, your home country, Colombia, what has happened there? Because it's touted as a success story.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation, David. Colombia has made a steady decline over the past decade in terms of poverty. It went from 30.4% in 2010 to 17.5% last year. And that's a really important reduction of poverty, mainly because there have been important investments in education, food and nutrition programs that have decreased the overall multidimensional poverty index in the country.
So poverty's been halved over a period of just a few years. Was it always the aim of this particular government to tackle that? I mean, what made the change possible?
I think what actually made the change possible is that there has been steady contribution of different governments. So there have been at least 3 or 4 governments who have been already decreasing the levels of poverty, even if they are different political parties. There is an agreement in the country that poverty should be a priority, poverty reduction should be a priority, and hence they've put all the government infrastructure to reduce poverty in all of its forms and dimensions.
And what difference has that made to the lives of Colombians?
Oh, in many different ways. Multidimensional poverty, which is what I do research on, looks at education, health, and living standards. For unprivileged Colombians who have been beneficiaries from these programs, they have been able to attend school, to access clean sanitation, to have houses, because many of these unprivileged communities didn't even have a house. So there has been significant investment in across the country to provide these public services for the poorest communities of the country.
Thanks very much. I'll come back to you, Felipe, to talk about Sierra Leone and to reflect on Colombia a little later in the program. But Asad, I want to talk to you first of all about India. 271 million people, it is claimed, lifted out of poverty over a 10-year period from 2005. How was that achieved?
Well, I maybe just take a step back. I mean, I think it's important for us to first say when people talk about people lifting people out of poverty, what they actually mean is lifting people out of extreme poverty. That's people who usually live on less than $2 a day, roughly about $1.90. That's not lifting people out of poverty. And in fact, overall, the figures of people who live in poverty roughly are staying the same globally. Yes, there has been a lift within the Indian subcontinent over the last decade of the number of people who are at the extreme end of poverty, but generally poverty and poverty ratios haven't dramatically changed. Now, there are a lot of arguments as to how India has achieved that. There have been some states which have been very progressive and have tried to tackle that multidimensional poverty and have invested in health and education, recognizing that guaranteeing people income, protecting land rights and supporting farmers, particularly in a rural country where over 70% of the people rely on agriculture and rural living is really important. And the other element, I mean, I suppose the current government would say this is a result of their policies of liberalizing the economy, inviting investment in, some would say, they would argue, in weakening labor laws, in rolling back some of those rights, in creating the conditions for, trickle down of wealth to come down from wealth generation.
But what are the biggest issues still there?
Well, look, I mean, what we've seen generally across the Indian subcontinent, and I think it's a story around the world, is you can't really talk about poverty without talking about inequality. And inequality within the Indian subcontinent has dramatically increased. There are now 43 billionaires in India who own more wealth than the majority of the population. Something like 73% of all the income, all the wealth that's generated each and every year goes to the top 1%. And the poorest half of the population are seeing their wealth increase by an average of only 1%. So whilst there is a slow and steady increase at the lowest, actually what's happened is inequality has widened. And so the gap between the richest and the poorest is going wider and wider in the Indian subcontinent. And that is a real crisis. And it's not simply about the Indian subcontinent, it's all around the world. We are, you know, when we look back, for example, to development policy and look back at the 1960s, I think something like the ratio between the richest countries per capita and the poorest countries was about, 36-1. It's now quadrupled. So inequality between countries and inequality within countries is increasing. And of course, that is creating huge social tension. It's creating conflict, and it's not actually delivering the dignified life that I think the majority of the world's citizens obviously want and need.
So it's a small change, an important change for so many people coming out of extreme poverty, but nonetheless, a great deal more still needs to be done. And Rio, I want to ask you about that. Indonesia is touted as a success story. What issues still remain there when it comes to the poorest people?
After the decentralization started in 2000s, we already have several sources of economic growth outside Java Island. Also, new institutions have established to debottleneck the problem in poverty reduction programs such as corruptions. And this reform has bring Indonesia better bureaucratic knowledge of local context, increased government accessibility and accountability.
Are there particular groups that have benefited? Is it women? Is it children? What is it?
Yeah, the targeted population are for the people who live in the east area and in this area, because there's been inequality in Indonesia between the west and the east area. So in terms for the gender, we actually do not have a specific issue on that. So the problem here related to the inequality and poverty is related to the region perspective.
Yes, thanks. We're going to stop there for a moment. We do, Arijo, I'm terribly sorry, have sound issues. Felipe, let me come to you. Colombia, before we move on to Sierra Leone, because they're very different countries. Were there many obstacles in the path of those wanting to try and reduce poverty, i.e. corruption, intransigence, and so on?
Sure. I think one of the obstacles has been mainly funding regarding these social programs and the measurement itself. Because what measures gets done, and over the past years, the country has been improving its way of measuring both multidimensional and monetary poverty. With the new measurement that the country has developed over the last decade, the country has been able to better target where are the poor, who are they? Are they men? Are they women? But this information was not available a few years back, and hence why progress towards reducing poverty was slower. With better information tools and statistical analysis, the country has been able to better target those poor communities.
And is it the rural communities that have benefited the most, or the urban poor as well?
Well, rural poverty is the highest in the country at the moment, and not only rural poverty, but rural women are the most affected by poverty. Urban areas have been able to reduce poverty at a fastest pace. When we look at access to drinking water or sewage services or education, urban areas take the lead in those areas, but rural areas are falling behind.
Now, I don't know quite how you tied in your work between Sierra Leone and Colombia when it comes to analyzing this, but would you care to compare and contrast?
Yeah, sure. Well, in our latest report, the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index that we at the University of Oxford produced annually with the UN Development Program, we found that Sierra Leone was one of the countries that reduced poverty at a fastest pace over the past few years. They reduced it by 16% between 2013 and 2017, which was also the time of the Ebola crisis. And so this is one of the aspects that the report highlights, because in the midst of health crisis, the country was able to reduce poverty in a significant way.
So it's not a question of it not being possible to do it if the will is there.
Basically, that's the main question. And when the will is there, and mostly when there is political will and leadership at the highest level, we've learned and we have been able to see with the countries that we've been working on that when the leadership is taking place at the highest level to reduce poverty, then the poverty reduction will be more effective.
Assad, let me come to you, because you hinted at what Olivier de Schutter, the UN rapporteur, told us earlier in the program. What he says is that progress is there, but it is pretty insignificant.
It is. Look, since 1990, was roughly about 3.5 billion people in the world living on about $5 a day. And that's, $5 a day basically gets you some of the barest essentials. This is not dignified life. I mean, if we were talking about, people having dignity, we were talking about roughly about $10 a day at least. And despite 30 years of all of these programs, that number has largely remained the same. And yes, there has been a lifting out of extreme poverty in India and China as the two biggest overall sort of contributors. But as Felipe said, look, poverty is a political choice, right? It is something that can be eradicated. We have the tools. It's not an issue that we don't have the technical ability to be able to do it. The question is there a political will, and do governments have the right tools? Now, with all the best will in the world, it's hard for governments, and particularly in poor countries, to be able to eradicate poverty when at the same time they are being told by whether it's the World Bank or the IMF to open up their economies, to privatize vital public health systems and public services, which we all know are critical to eradicating multidimensional poverty. When they talk about that they need a deregulated labor market to be able to increase investments of corporations. And so, what we've seen that since 1985, for every dollar that flows to the global south to poor countries, something like $24 flows back out from poorer countries to rich countries.
I do understand that, and
unless
I just want to get on, if I may, Assad, onto Pakistan, because we're running out of time in this split. Poverty reduction down to 24% in 2019, but it claims it can reduce it by half as much again by 2030. Possible?
Look, as I said, if a government is serious about tackling wealth inequality, and some initiatives of the government, for example, particularly around going after the rich, about tax, people paying their fair share, trying to track down in terms of the illicit tax flows that are flowing out of the country, reinvesting. But what also needs to happen, of course, is policies around on education, particularly around tackling gender violence and patriarchy, investment in terms of around labor laws. And often what we see is this duality of challenge that governments want to do both things are often only told you can only do one.
I do get that. I do get that. Thank you. Felipe, let me ask you this one. In the first part of the program, I quoted the Chinese state media saying you can learn from our wisdom in reducing poverty. What can other countries learn from Colombia and from Sierra Leone?
Well, other countries can learn several things. For example, in the midst of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Colombian government has been able to react quickly to address the crisis. First, to support the poorest, and second, to identify those who are vulnerable to poverty. And that's why, this is why the country has developed important statistical tools to identify those who are poor, either by subnationally, by gender, by region, ethnically, and in many other ways.
So
In
get
fact,
yourself as a health authority, as a government, educated about what you can do, and in the meantime, of course, educate your people. Is that what you're suggesting?
yeah, well, what I'm trying to say is the statistical information that the country has been able to gather in a very sophisticated way has been able to put on some lens and to see better where the poorest populations are, and hence target those populations who are poor or vulnerability or in vulnerable state to poverty, so that the country can address better their situation.
Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. Continue your great work in helping us all understand how these problems can be solved. Much appreciated your time on the program, as with you, wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team, goodbye for now. Hope to have your company next time.